Hey everyone, I wanted to talk to you today about picking a topic and developing a question in IR6690. And this is meant to be, for people. Hopefully you're seeing this before the course even begins so we can get a running start on things. But this is about how to select a topic for the research project that you have to do in the capstone. Now, just to start off, what are we here to do, right? Um, uh, King, Cohen, and Verba have this definition of scientific research because that's what we're here to do. You're here to do a research paper, okay? So what is research? Well, scientific research is designed to make descriptive or explanatory inferences based on empirical information about the world. So key thing is, first of all, descriptive, we don't like that so much. We really like explanatory inferences, which goes to causality, right? We try to explain things. What do we try to explain? Our dependent variable. We want to explain something and based on empirical information. Right? And this is a very important aspect of this paper is that you do have to get to looking at facts, observations, data, whatever you want to call it. It's about being empirical. Right? We're looking at the world, and so it can't just be theoretical. And this somewhat constrains what you can choose to do. I always like to simplify the idea of scientific inquiry to what one of my professors said to me. He said, when we utter a sentence about reality, we do something to prove it's right. And that's very much what the paper is going to be about. And a lot of picking the topic is finding that sentence about reality that we want to do something to. And Riker actually, when he said that, I wanted to point out, I may have, or it just may have been something I thought in my head that, well, we don't prove anything, right? We just test things. Yeah, whatever, right? would be his point. But this is informal, right? So the point though is our topic is about, we're trying to figure out the thing we want to test. We're trying to come up with the conjecture about causality in the world that we want to test by looking at information. And that's what ultimately picking a topic is about. Standards. Your topic has to be a non-trivial, generalizable aspect of IR. All right. So it has to be interesting in some way and important. And it has to be about IR. And this is sometimes a tricky thing. A lot of times, now, how do we go? We want it to be generalizable. Well, a lot of things are generalizable, right? You could look at the violence in Hong Kong. And yeah, you're looking at Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is not trivial, right, in itself. And you want to put, very often we try to put things in a context of broader nations and other things. But honestly, even with this generalizable, I mean, how China deals with Hong Kong is non-trivial, right, in and of itself. The thing is, we don't want to have things so specific, right? So, maybe looking at very specific things of like, something that happens to Xi Jinping and might have had an effect on him. If it was something so idiosyncratic as to be kind of a historical anomaly and not a generalizable phenomena, that would be, problematic. More importantly, though, is the idea of it being an aspect of IR. This comes into play when students, very often there are a lot of things that you can look at that involve non-political science technical aspects, right? A lot of things dealing with the military, right? I had a student who did a capstone paper on the transponders and how traffic control systems identify civilian aircraft. And, it was very easy for him to get into the technical aspects of that and not be talking about IR, right? And he ended up shifting, I got him over to talk about whether or not being a part having a IFF system, although there's another name for it in the broader civilian context, but having that system, whether being part of an international standards, whether having signed on to an international agreement affected the performance of those things. Okay, now we're talking IR because we're talking about the role of international agreements on outcomes, right? Okay, good to go. That's basically, with climate change, people will talk about climate change. It's very easy to get lost in the technical, is climate changing? How much of the world is going to be flooded? And, those ecological hard sciencey questions are fascinating, but totally not the subject of what we're doing. However, you could look at, well, do agreements about carbon, do international norms or rules about carbon sharing or carbon limits or taxes or whatever, have they worked in the past, right? Well, now we're talking IR. So this is a key thing as you go through. You've got to stay on the political side of things and looking at IR aspects. But usually this isn't a problem. The other standards, just more generally, that you're going to have to meet in your research is you're going to have to meet the standard of accumulation. You must build on previous scholarly work, which is where the lit review comes in. And that's why automatically we go into, as soon as you're interested in a topic, you start looking at previous scholarly work. And then originality, you've got to go beyond scholarly work, right? And this is what freaks people out. How can I do better than what's out there? Well, again, part of the lit review process is to look at the literature and say, well, what aspect of this have they not looked at? Where are the gaps? What's something I could do? Can I look at, here's this quantitative result somebody has. Can I look at how it played out in a particular case or in a critical case? Or, there's a lot of things you can do. And again, these two things are established, you meet these criteria through the lit review process. Very important, right? So we must build on scholarly work. We must stand on the shoulders of those who went before, and we must reach, if not higher, at least in a different direction. And then method. Your research must employ a scholarly method, right? And this is something that is going to be part of the research design. You've got to, in doing research, you have to follow systematic steps that very clearly, you have to have this explicit and analytic framework that prior to going into it, it makes sense what you're going to do, and that what you're going to do fits with the literature that is going to answer the question you're trying to do, and it's going to produce a conclusion. You're not just going to talk about the subject for 20 pages and then come to conclusions. No. You need to have an explicit, systematic, that is, a step-by-step plan for answering a question. So what are the standards for method? Next slide, right? Empirical, got to be based on the real world. Systematic follows I talked about that already. Transparent, the steps must be fully described so others can follow, right? This is reproducibility, reliability. And like I say, it's got to be clear what your steps are, right? And it should be something that, and this will be something that comes up when you do your research design, it should be very clear what you're going to do. And when it's clear what you're going to do, the value of it, why are you doing it, right? What's the point? How are we getting into this, right? And finally, it has to be persuasive. This is more subjective, but your end result must provide some support for the conclusion. Now, remember, your conclusion can go one way or the other, right? I mean, we aren't engaged in rhetoric. We aren't trying to prove a predetermined point. We're trying to test the hypothesis, or we're trying to, we've uttered a sentence about reality in terms of, what we think is going on in the world, or we are, better yet, we're looking at somebody else's sentence about reality and seeing whether or not it holds water, right? Whether it's can be supported by the facts. And so that's where we're going in broad terms with this. Okay, now getting more focused on picking a topic. I'm going to be honest with you. It's very hard to comment on topics. When someone says, "Oh, I want to do my topic on, you know, uh, China and the seas," I mean, it's like, all right, I want to talk about South China Sea. All right, well, what about it, right? I mean, fine. I'm sure there's a topic in there somewhere, and it's rare that you could tell me what you're interested in and there not be a topic in there in some way or another. Like the guy who witnessed the student who wanted to talk about aircraft traffic control systems, right? We moved that in a direction, we were able to move that in the proper direction, right? To get it to be a good thing. So this is what I say is it's hard to comment other than to say, well, you may need to move this in a direction. You need to develop the topic, and every topic needs to be developed. So how do you go about it? I mean, in broad terms, you determine your interest, right? The first thing you've got to do, and I can't help you with this, is you've got to complete the phrase, I'm doing my paper on, right? And I'm doing my paper, or I want to do my paper on whatever. You have to be interested in a topic to write a paper on it. So your interest is very valid. What you want to do is a very valid parameter here in what you have to be interested in it. So once you do that, immediately you need to start surveying the literature. You got to surf the journals online, right? And you are looking at, how are the issues in which you're interested broken up? How have people defined key concepts, right? What questions have they asked? How have they posed them? What answers have they provided? And I should definitely have in here, what methods have they used, right? What's people have ideas, they probably come to conclusions on your topic, or maybe they haven't, right? If it's wide open, but, and what are the methods they used? Could they be improved on, right? So this is what you want to get a sense of. And as you read through this, you narrow your interest, you focus, hopefully you will become more focused on a particular aspect of the topic through your own, just interest, okay? Keeping in mind, it is better to be narrow and deep than broad and shallow, right? So here's how you're in all of this, you are developing a topic, right? And in a lot of ways, I make this distinction between the topic, the thing that you want to talk about in the world, right? China's policy in the South Seas, yeah, right? And these are broader, the broader questions about the world versus what you actually research, right? The question you ask, the research question you focus on, which is going to be a more narrow, empirical question that is going to have a factual answer, right? And is going to be the stepping stone for making an inference or conclusion about the broader topic, right? And so I don't know if it's helpful, but I always to everyone, but I generally conceive of research as having broad topics of the world, things you're interested in the world, about in the world, and then looking at conducting very focused empirical inquiries or tests, or we don't do experiments, right? But we look at things to see, all right, what's the implication of this, right? What does this little factoid, or this more narrow, something, a question that can be objectively answered, right, by looking at data or facts or observations or history, and then you make an inference. Say, all right, since this is the case, what's the implication, the broader implication of this? And this is what you do in the conclusion, right? And you comment on the topic. So I see that as being a big part of what you do. And you start out with the topic, and then you do the lit review, and then you narrow your focus on that question. Now, how do you do that? First of all, it's about identifying variables, okay? You have to have a dependent variable. This is the thing you want to explain in all your textbooks. It's denoted as Y, right? And so, in realism, the balance, the dependent variable is the occurrence of war, right? Then you also, so once you have the thing you want to explain, you probably have some idea about what you think explains it. But you go to the lit review process, and part of the lit review process should be, if you're following this right, if you're following the idiom of social science research, which is about dependent variables, testing hypotheses of how independent variables affect dependent variables, right? All that crap in 6601 in your methods text, right? That framework, that way of looking at it, that perspective, however you want to put it, I'm calling it an idiom. That way of looking at it is very beneficial, right? It fits. But it can be constraining, and it might not fit with your topic. So we don't want to be wedded to it, right? But generally, if you really do need to have a dependent variable. You really need to have the thing. It's got to be clear. Like the first freaking sentence of your paper should make it very clear what your dependent variable is, okay? And then you're looking for independent variables, right? What are the things that are thought to cause it? And like I say, part of the lit review is, it's naturally going to show, you're going to find out, hey, this is what people think affects this, right? This is what, what people think affects what's going on. And conjectures about causality are basically theories, right? And I use an example, perhaps unfortunately, of realism, but any explanation of the world, anytime somebody issues, and I'm going off of the text I use now, Kelstad and Witten define a theory as conjecture about causality. And I love that, because anytime you have somebody say, I think this is what's going on under the surface, this is what's causing the thing we're interested in explaining, i.e. our dependent variable, that's a theory. And that conjecture identifies an independent variable. So if you get, if you can get into this zone, right, now we're able to say, all right, what can we do with that, right? We have this conjecture about causality in the world. How can we apply it, or how does it fit with what you're talking about? Okay, and this is where you develop the question. Now this, like what I'm talking about here, this is a future thing, right? But the point is, hey, you're picking a topic. This is the direction you're going to go, right? You're going to do a lit review. You're going to look at what people have written. And then your reaction, and the key thing is the lit review should help you evolve or develop your question, right? The thing you're actually going to look at. And you need to determine the aspect of the problem you're most interested in, define your concepts, right? And so, you want to say, all right, what are the different concepts involved here? And don't do this, a lot of people will give this laundry list of definitions. Not a lot of people, but I counter this sometimes. People who don't really know what they're doing or don't really understand why they're doing it will say, all right, well, let me define every concept related to this, right? And it's like, well, I need the major concepts defined. I need you to say, all right, what do you mean by this? What are the variables? Generally you need, and these are the key things. You need to define your dependent and independent variables. Those are the things that are important. Defining things that you aren't testing relationships between is kind of like, well, all right, great. You're talking about something that's only tangentially related. So, and the key thing you're trying to do is you've got to pose a question in a way it can be answered. And what we're looking at is you have to say, all right, I'm interested in this aspect. What is something that I can do to test, to find out whether or not what the causality is, and presumably you have conjecture about it. You have ideas from the literature about what the cause and effect relationships are in the world, and then your question is, all right, how can I look at this case, or all cases, or what can I do to test this out, to see if this holds water in the context I'm interested in it, right? And so that is something you want to be able to pose a question in a way that can be answered objectively with information, right? And you also want to consider possible answers or alternatives. You want to say, well, I'm going to look at this and, what if you're going to be, if you're doing research properly, there is a it's not for sure you're going to get a yes, right? You might end up with, well, the information supports the conjecture or it deflates it. Well, you've got to be ready for either one. And it's good if you war game this in your head and think, all right, what if I get a negative result? Now, if you've come in and suggested a relationship between things that is bizarre or highly questionable in the first place, right? Like, does the astrological sign of a leader make a difference, right? In how they deal in a crisis? Well, if you go through and you can create a test and you could very quickly, if you could get a number of cases and you could test whether or not, certain signs were, and you could use astrology to make predictions about, Scorpios would do better than whatever. I don't even know, right? But you could do that. But when you got a negative, and sure, if you had very strong empirical results, people would be like, holy crap. But when you probably get more mixed results, people will be like, well, of course not. What the hell are you doing here? So you want to be able to say, hey, if you don't find support for the theory, that's significant, right? And usually that is significant if you have a significant number, or you have a portion of the scholarship that says, yes, this is what was going on. And if you say, well, no, they're wrong, there you go. You've contributed to the literature. Or if you support them, great. So that's what I'm saying. You want to consider, case in point, when I was doing my dissertation, I was going into, I'm like, oh, I'm going to do all this stuff. You have to go through a formal defense process. And I'm like, well, I'm going to do this, figuring out how sanctions work and determine the conditions under which they'll be effective. And what if you find that, in your early stages that there aren't conditions in which sanctioning is effective? And I said, aha, then I'll be done early, because everyone seems to think it's theoretically effective. But not, I pointed to the literature where they kept saying this, and I said, if I come up with this other thing, then I'm going to have been, great, I'm done, and in fact, that's exactly what happened. I'm a doctor today because of it. So that's my point, is you want to consider the answers, right? So, but this is where you're going with it. You're going to develop that nested question. And so the idea is, at the beginning, you're picking a topic and you're engaging in a process that eventually goes through the lit review and into finally picking a research question, something you're actually going to look at in your paper.